This is a special treat this year because we have several new panelists who haven't been with us before. Can you see me on that side? Let me see if I can. Yeah, it's not that I'm that great to look at, but it's sort of. We have some new panelists, which Luisa and Dan are the first time they've been with us, and so we're happy that they've been able to come from us. We have people from Mexico, Miami, New York, Toronto, and Washington, D.C., and I guess Columbia/Toronto for me. So it's great to be able to bring this kind of crowd and these kinds of panelists up to Toronto for this kind of a conversation. In preparation for today's event, I was looking at the event the tape of the event we did last year, and a couple of things stood out to me. One was that there was significantly less facial hair on the panelists than there was, than there is this year. It's not a bad look. I'm not. There's nothing against it. I'm just a comment and observation. And the second thing, and we'll get into a little bit during the course of the morning, is all of our predictions were right, which is really quite remarkable. Even the political ones and the economic ones. And if you want to see for yourself, you can actually go look at the tape. It's online. It's on our website, and you can see. But there was some of the predictions were rather bold. Some of them maybe less bold, but they were all sort of spot on. Which is to say, if there's anything you ever want to know about Latin America, CC is your source, and this event will tell you everything you need to know for the entire year. No need to go anywhere else. So the goal this year, though, you wouldn't know by the long soliloquy I'm involved in now, is to keep things short. There's just so much to cover. 2018 was an incredibly important year. People might say seismic changes, at least in the political structures, or at least in the political personalities. What seems to portend politically going forward, and of course, economically as well. We're coming off a year with 6 elections, including in major countries, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, 2 of which have brought sweeping changes to the political system. We've come off a year with sluggish economic growth, and we've come off a year where nobody knows what's going to happen in a lot of directions, and hopefully today we'll be able to sort some of that out. In addition to talking about the elections that are coming up this year, it's not as many as there were last year, but it was Uruguay and Argentina and Bolivia are on slate for this year. At least those 3 that immediately come to mind. So I think to start off, maybe we'll ask Jonathan if he could just have a conversation a bit about situating Latin America in the global context at this point, economically. Where do you see Latin America fitting in with the trends going on now?
Sure. But before I do that, I'd like to also thank our sponsors for making this event possible. Thank Ken and Marta for their leadership in keeping the CCA moving forward and delivering for its members. So as chair, I'd just like to thank you all also for coming and making this event the kickoff for the year that we hope it is, and give you some insight. So to your question, Ken, so I think maybe talking a little bit about 2018 is important to think about 2019. 2018 was a pretty rotten year, quite frankly, as it relates to the economic environment for LATAM and frankly all emerging markets, particularly those that have weak external liquidity. It wasn't a good time to not have your act together in 2018. So the Fed was looking at a normalization path, which is highly toxic to countries that rely on external financing. The Chinese economy was rolling over quite substantially, and therefore putting quite a brake on the export markets, particularly in commodities that a lot of countries in Latin America rely on. And so and then of course you had the advent of the trade tensions that now boiled over into a full scale war between China and the United States, but also the United States, just for good measure, picked fights with even its best friends, including Canada. So it was not a good year. 2019 is shaping up to be probably, from an external point of view, a better year. So the Fed is closer to the end of that hiking cycle than the beginning. The market is now only incorporating 2 hikes instead of 3 at this stage. My view is that there'll be fewer than 2. And the Chinese situation has stabilized in 2 dimensions. The first is there is stimulus being put back into the Chinese system, particularly through the monetary channel, but also now the fiscal channel. And there is, I think, an awareness now among the Chinese leadership that they've got to make a deal with the United States, even if it's a somewhat short-term one and even slightly Pyrrhic for them, because they need about 2 to 3 years more of those open export markets to export into to maintain the growth trajectory of the economy. So probably looking at a bit of a respite for LATAM in the next year. But I would just say one thing as caution and then close. 2 of those 3 things that I described are not likely to be stable for a sustained period. One, the Chinese economy is likely to slow for reasons that have nothing to do with Donald Trump or trade, but have to do with demographics and have to do with the transition taking place in the Chinese economy. So we cannot expect that same dynamic in the supercycle that led to LATAM's golden decade, which many unfortunately squandered. And second, the trade tensions are not going to go away. There is an implacable conflict here between 2 systems, and it was best just demonstrated, frankly still being demonstrated in the Huawei crisis, that are just not compatible. And so we will have some, what in Arabic they call the hudna, a truce, but not a peace. So I think those leaders in LATAM have to be quite conscious of the fact that the environment might get rocky again.
Eduardo, where does that leave Latin America? China's slowing down a bit. The U.S. appears to be slowing down a bit. What happens to Latin America?
I'm less concerned. For this year, we have growth holding up. What I'm a bit concerned about Latin America is capital flows. The year is starting off very, very, very well for Latin America, but we have a couple of problems. The first one is the comparative valuations. After the collapse we've seen in U.S. equities for the last a few weeks, you now have basically the same yield implied in U.S. equities as in Latin American equities at a time when you have more currency risk because of the reasons Jonathan said implied in Latin America. So that's not a bet I would take long term myself. From the other risk is, if you look at, for example, the behavior of the Mexican peso over the uncertainty of the last month and a half, it was remarkable how well it held up. But there's a reason for it. The central bank got way ahead of the curve by hiking very aggressively. That's not the case in much of Latin America, and I think 2 clear examples there are Brazil and Colombia, 2 countries where the central bank has kept rates at very low. We have spreads between the policy rates in those countries and the U.S. rates literally at historical lows. And that's not a good point to be heading into a period of uncertainty. So I think those 2 countries will have to act more aggressively from the central bank perspective in order to avoid problems when the global cycle turns, which I expect to happen in the next couple of months. I think with the year starting off favorably from a risk appetite perspective, but I think that will change.
Luisa, how do you think this is going to affect the oil and the gas, to a certain extent, the market, these changes that we're talking about?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. So I wanted to get that out of there. So building on Jonathan and Eduardo's comments, the 3 things that matter in Latin America definitely is what's going on with the Fed and therefore IR differentials with global markets. The China component, just because of the importance of China as a trading partner, both from a terms of trade perspective and volume perspective. But the third thing is commodities. This is a commodity-driven region, more so than any of the other emerging markets regions. On the oil side, I would say I'm much less constructive than you are, which will affect countries in different ways, because not all countries are as dependent on commodities and on oil prices in particular. I think it is very relevant for us to bring that discussion because oil prices most likely are going to be significantly down from the average that we saw in 2018. And right now we have a glut in the markets, and that glut in the markets resembles very much what happened in 2014. The U.S. oil production is at historical highs, and it will remain every month hitting historical highs until probably May 2019. So OPEC is again trying to cushion that increase in oil production from the U.S., which the Energy Information Administration is already putting at 1.2 million barrels per day, which is pretty much what oil demand grows every year. So that already tells you that Latin American countries in the first half, at least in the first half of 2019, will have to cope as well with this glut in oil prices. Natural gas prices, I think, and natural gas markets are, although they follow very closely oil markets, I think we are a little bit more constructive on them. But I would say that you still have somewhere to go in relation to the outlook for oil prices, which will be relevant.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in John in a second to talk about some of the implications for Canada and Canada business.
Can I just add something on a regional basis? First of all, as a board member, I want to thank Deloitte and Craig for hosting us. Of all the places we've had this event, I think this is the most impressive. So thank you.
Well, because you like sitting on the bar stool. Basically.
That's right. That's right. There's one element that, first of all, I work mostly with companies that sell into the region or invest in the region. And what's clear to me from everything that's being said and what we've seen for the last few years is top-line growth, particularly measured in dollars, is going to be very, very difficult to achieve in Latin America while we have low commodity prices and rising interest rates. But what we're seeing in Latin America right now, where there's an opportunity, whether it's for Canadian companies or others, is disruption. The service sector in Latin America has basically avoided the pressures, the global pressures of free trade agreements that the manufacturing and agricultural sectors have been forced to compete globally. Latin America's service sectors remain incredibly inefficient. And what we're seeing is that efforts to disrupt, Uber is a great example. In the United States, it took 9 years for Uber to achieve a market penetration equivalent of about 15% of American adults. 15% of American adults use Uber. In Mexico, it took 3 years to get to 13% of the Mexican population using Uber. They went from 20 cars to 500,000 cars in less than 5 years. The ability to disrupt is where we're going to see opportunities in Latin America. The ability to cut costs is how you should be looking at your Latin American investment, those who are strategic investors. That's where the money's going to be made, not in terms of banking on a top-line growth. So just wanted to add that comment.
Great. Eduardo, I wanted to come back to you on one issue, and we're going to get to it certainly when we talk about the political ramifications of what's going on and the changes. But the introduction of more foreign competitors, as it were, or players in the economic sphere in Latin America, right? The Chinese investment last year was a third more than it was the previous year, which was high. I mean, like last year, I think it was close to $27 billion. It's now the main trading partner for Argentina, Brazil, and Chile. Other countries are spending a lot more time. I mean, Holland was looking around, trying to do things. Japan, not that they haven't done a little bit in the past, but it seems like people are more, quote, discovering Latin America, and a lot of the Chinese investment are in areas that are particularly of interest to Canada, like infrastructure. So what is the introduction of these new players and the increased involvement of China, for example? What's the effect in Latin America, and to an extent, how do you see that affecting possibilities for Canadian business in Latin America?
I guess the first thing is to kind of ruin the way I traditionally thought about Latin America of two big blocks, Mercosur and Pacific Alliance. Those lines are being blurred. Brazil is now opening up, and Mexico seems to be on the path to caring less about the world, particularly from an economic standpoint. And so those lines are being blurred. And that in itself brings another actor. Brazil may change the way it plays ball around Latin America, and to some degree, if Macri holds, Argentina may do as well. So within the region, the role of players will change. China is an important player from a geopolitical standpoint. And it may, like for example in Venezuela's case, has been used as a counterweight to other regional players. We'll see if it starts playing a more important role in Mexico. So that's from a risk perspective, that the politics around the region may be less predictable or less easy to play for North American players. And another player that I think can start playing a bigger role for investors from Canada in particular in the region is the Pacific Rim investors. Some of the Asian investors have increasingly become active in parts of Latin America, places like the Japanese pension funds or Singapore, etc. But now Australia is another big player who now, with CPTPP, will potentially start looking more in Latin America. If you look at, for example, the largest pension fund in Latin America, in Australia, the Superannuation Fund, is a massive fund. It's about, $2 trillion. And at this moment, they have marginal investments in the region. They can start becoming another competitor to start playing ball in Latin America. So I think we're going to have a lot of things. Something that will add uncertainty, the entrance of players who will play politics next to economics, Chinese investors, the different role that Brazil playing in the region, potentially becoming more confrontational to what was traditionally the less market-friendly countries in the region. More uncertainty on Mexico from a geopolitical standpoint, and the way we'll play ball with say the US and China going forward, and opportunities for the markets that open, but also risks from the new entrants.
Jonathan, you're a major investor in infrastructure in Latin America.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to distinguish between the stock of capital and the capacity to deploy it. So for sure, there is a large stock of assets to be mobilized, say, out of Australia, et cetera. But, LATAM is not for beginners. And so I think that will be, from what I understand of where the Future Fund and where the other funds in Australia are thinking, that will likely be pushed out quite a ways, and I think they'll be acting mainly through funds. So the real question is the pricing of these assets going to get out of whack, such that the only people who buy them are Chinese because they have a totally different cost of capital? And that phenomenon has occurred, there's no question. And I think that there's very significant geopolitical implications of that, which aren't all one way. So if you look at the African example, there is a lot of pushback right now occurring, particularly in Eastern Africa, where the kind of the contract that was made with Chinese investors has come under a little bit of pressure from national governments who are saying, I'm not sure this actually works for us so well. So the deal was, we'll build a lot of infrastructure for you, we'll do this stuff, and we'll finance it all through China Development Bank, and everybody will be happy. But the problem is, these countries, Kenya for example, they have a notion of wanting to develop legitimate and authentic local business. And that is really what's distinguished these countries from the rest of sub-Saharan Africa for the last 30 years. And that is being stifled by being dumped upon low-grade goods at very low prices. So there is, and that, by the way, that phenomenon has happened in Brazil as well. So that, I think, we need to think of the to and the fro as it relates to these pools of capital.
John or Luisa, you want to?
I just wanted to add one interesting new player that you'll read about more in the next couple of years is Qatar. The Qatar-Saudi relationship is not unlike Taiwan-China. And Qatar is being increasingly isolated in the GCC by the Saudis. And they realize that they need to win friends globally. And they've been essentially shut out of their natural foreign investment fields like Eastern Africa and the rest of the Middle East by the Saudis. And so they're interested in Latin America. And they've already invested in offshore field concessions in Mexico and in Brazil. And I think you'll see more and more investment. The emir left his country for 10 years. When you come from a country like Qatar, to leave it for 10 days is kind of dangerous. But he left for 10 days and toured 4 countries in Latin America. And I think you'll see more money flowing into Latin America. And that's interesting for Canada, because Canada has world-class oil and gas service companies who don't necessarily lead investments around the world, but they latch on to those investments and service those companies. Qatar traditionally has partnered with Exxon in Latin America, and I think they'll continue to do so. But these are companies that are great potential, clients for Canadian service companies.
Right. Luisa, please.
So I think one of the things that has happened with Chinese investments across the board, and building on what Jonathan is just saying, is that it's not only in Africa. I mean, changes in administration in Malaysia and Pakistan started to lead to revisions of Chinese contracts. I have the feeling that Chinese involvement in Latin America is also about to change regionally. My impression is that the Bolsonaro administration is really not pro-China, and China has been a hotspot for Chinese investments until now. It could be the case that the Chinese investments in Mexico are going to significantly increase, just because there's a little bit more of a sympathy from both governments, which is a place that has never really been a market for Chinese investment, given that they're competitors rather than alternative or supplemental type of investors. The last thing about China is that their experience in investing in Latin America has really not been a great one, particularly because they put a lot of their eggs in Venezuela, and that went very badly. And in Ecuador, so far, it's not very clear either. So Brazil was the one place where the returns of investments were clear. In the rest of the region, it has not been that obvious. And the pursuit of investments in Latin America, just because you want to secure commodities, it's understandable from a geopolitical perspective, but it has really not panned out as they thought.
Great, thank you. Well, we'll talk a lot more about Bolsonaro and Brazil and each of the countries in a few minutes when we start to go country by country analysis. But I think this is a great segue, Dan. Thank you for being patient to bring you into this conversation. You were director of Western Hemisphere for Vice President Biden, and through which essentially the Obama administration ran its Latin American policy, and then you stayed on to do the same position with Vice President Pence. What's your view, and I suppose to some extent, what's the U.S. view, there's two hats perhaps, of the introduction of the new competitors? Obviously talking about the economic competition, but clearly there's a political competition going on as well, and particularly in light of the U.S., we might say, withdrawal from active political engagement in Latin America, except on, seems to be another narrow file of drugs and security issues. So, broad question. Let's start off with the introduction or the increasing influence of non-hemispheric countries in the hemisphere.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Ken. I want to reiterate the other panelists and thanking CCA and the sponsors. And for Blue Star Strategies, Ken has been a very important partner. And I want to recognize my CEO, Karen Tramontano, actually came up from Washington. As you mentioned, I worked for Vice President Biden. Actually, my last trip in government was to Canada with the Vice President when Justin Trudeau received him in Ottawa in December of 2016. And when we arrived on that night, there was a heavy snowstorm. And so I was quite disappointed to come back to cold rain 2 years later. It wasn't quite as atmospheric, but nevertheless.
Well, look, when I left my apartment in Medellin on Sunday, I had my winter coat. And the doorman said to me, "Oh my God, Senor Don Ken," actually called me Don Ken, which is why I really love being in Colombia, Don Ken. And he said, "Well, where are you going? It looks so cold." And I said, "Well, I'm going to Canada." He goes, "It's cold there." I said, "It's very, very cold." And he said, "Is it as cold as it is in Bogota?"
Exactly, for a sense of perspective. But to touch on this question of kind of, quote, external actors in Latin America and the Western Hemisphere and what the U.S. view is, there really has been, I think, a dramatic shift under the Trump administration. The view of the Obama administration was that we were in a globalized world, that we had a lot more to gain from cooperation than from competition, and that we really need to focus on making sure that the United States, both the public sector and the private sector, had value added for the region and to drive forward regional integration. And in fact, Secretary of State John Kerry gave a speech at the Organization of American States in 2013 where he declared the era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. A short 5 years later, the Monroe Doctrine is back in full force, to the extent that President Trump even highlighted it in his address to the United Nations General Assembly recently. And so that means that it's a much more, I think, competition-based view in the region. I'm not sure how well that's going down. From China's perspective, China got into Latin America, I wouldn't say exactly by accident, but it wasn't as if they did a kind of grand strategy and said, how do we move into this sphere of influence? It was a growing economy. It needed to buy stuff. It needed to buy soy. It needed to buy steel. It needed to buy copper. It needed to buy nickel. So it went around the world and said, well, where is this? And started purchasing. And it wasn't, and China had really become a major trading partner of many countries in the region by 2008. And that was when they put forward their first white paper on Latin America, outlining what might look like a strategy. And today, I mean, I actually wrote a piece recently on the inauguration of Bolsonaro and what this means for China. China's nervous about Brazil, but frankly, not that nervous. Why? Because it's a major trading partner of Brazil, and a lot of what Brazil has to export is going to go to China, whether Bolsonaro likes it or not. I don't think that he can do a dramatic trade adjustment away from China as much as he might like. There's other questions, I suppose, of Russia. I remember about 10 years ago, it was the role of Iran in Latin America was a big deal in the United States. We don't seem to hear much about that anymore. One just interesting statistic is that between 1960 and the year 2000, there was one book published in English on China-Latin American relations. Since the year 2000, there have been 15 books on that topic published in English. So it's really kind of captured the imagination of policymakers. But China at this point, I think, is really a fact of life for the region, and one that even the Trump administration is coming to grips with. It made a kind of big deal about the fact that Panama and several other countries switched recognition from Taiwan to China recently. But after the G20 in Argentina, President Xi Jinping's next stop was Panama. And you didn't hear much of the US out of that visit at all. So I think there's a certain pragmatism that's going to come into play.
And we'll get to a little bit of non-hemispheric national involvement in the hemisphere more, I think, when we talk about Venezuela. I mean, I think then the conversation around China and Russia, Cuba, and now a little bit Turkey and Iran now, I'm not so sure. So we can bring that back in. The political themes are so lush and so rich to have a conversation about it. And we only have a short amount of time to go through it, but I'll just made a note of several factors, and maybe people on the panel want to talk a little bit about the implications and what we see now. We have three major countries run by populists. That includes the United States. The real realization of evangelicals as a political force and other traditional religious actors. I know we have, I think, actually have a slide, do we not, of this was, yeah, well, see, now that was something, that's Jesus Christ admiring a picture of the now president of Colombia. Actually, that was real. That was sent to me by my mother-in-law, who's a real Uribista, and she's my favorite Uribista. She tells me I'm her favorite son-in-law. I'm her only son-in-law. But anyway, so religion is come back in a big way, and particularly the evangelical. And this is a phenomenon that's been developing for decades. And now, particularly in Brazil, AMLO negotiated with the evangelicals, made a pact with the evangelicals. The year started off with Costa Rica on the verge of being run by electing an evangelical, right? So that's a whole nother. In Colombia, you started to hear about conversations, more than hear about conversations, alliances made with evangelicals. And so this is a whole other force, I think, that's come more to the fore in the last couple of years, and particularly in the elections last year. Political polarization, is it worse now than it had been before? The decline in liberal democracy in more countries. Venezuela has gotten worse. Nicaragua has gone into a very precipitous decline very, very quickly. There is concern now about what's going on in Bolivia. An election is coming up, and the maniobra, or the machination to make it so Morales is running again against all what would appear to have been constitutional norms and restrictions. And of course, a big voter revolt over corruption, which is something that we talked about last year. And you see that particularly in Brazil and Mexico, and you see it playing out in other ways now, in a very big way in Peru, with the attempt in the last several days to fire the main prosecutors who were investigating Odebrecht. Jonathan, you were the one that last year, put your finger right on it when you said there's essentially seething anger in Brazil. And well before the election, you said, don't be surprised, essentially, if it's a Bolsonaro victory, is sort of the one who, and this is before Lula had been taken out of it, et cetera, et cetera. Does anyone want to address the issue of sort of the rise of populism and ramifications for governability going forward in a broad way? Jonathan,
sure, I can start. I don't know if you want a compendium on Brazil, but I think maybe taking a big step back, look, this is a global phenomenon, so there's nothing particularly special about Latin America as it relates to populism. I can go on for quite a long time talking about why existing institutions and the rules of the game that were associated with a certain consensus over the last 50 years seem to be coming apart. It has a little bit to do with technology, has a little bit to do with the inability of financial capitalism globally to deliver its promise. It has a lot to do with a lot of different things. But the common denominator is that there is an idiom of populism in every place, whether it's in the Philippines, where incidentally there's also been a huge rise of evangelical political activity. It may have something to do with the Catholic Church, but not that I'm an expert, but I'm just saying that there are things that are very common that are not just Latin American phenomena. Having said that, there is one observation I would make, which I think is very relevant to this conversation, and that is there's also sequencing. And the United States is a country where populism is viewed now as being a great aberration, and it is a reaction to rules of the game that got a bit ossified and viewed by many people in the electorate as out-of-date and unfair. Interestingly, that has caused the rise of a more corrupt and much less transparent government. In a country like Mexico, where the rules of the game were perhaps less transparent, now there is a political populism based on making it more transparent, at least ostensibly. So we see in countries that are less developed a reaction against elites that look to be unfair, untransparent, even criminal. And in the developed countries, you see the rise, and starting really, I was just going to say this one thing and we'll move on. Be very conscious of the fact that the clean hands movement in Italy that put Craxi in jail was followed by Berlusconi.
Yeah.
So in LATAM, we may be very happy to see the rooting out of corruption through a strong prosecutorial state judiciary in Brazil. But remember that that is a reaction that has itself its own reaction, which is the rise of populist and much more authoritarian kind of governments.
Everybody wants to comment on this. Great, John. Let me just skip to John, and then I got Luisa, absolutely, and Eduardo. John, last year, one of your sage predictions at this time was that AMLO was going to win. And I don't know if you remember. You never remember saying it, but it's actually it's been preserved on tape, so I know.
Okay,
it's
good. I got one thing.
It's not an alternative fact. Like you definitely said it. So, which was, and I'm giving it good for you. I mean, you got it right, and I think part of it was tapping into this kinds of conversation about anger, about corruption, about kinds of. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to address specifically the evangelicals because a lot of people are unaware of just how dramatically the social fabric of Latin America has changed over the last 30 years. In the United States, 20% of Americans go to church every week. In Mexico, the number's 8%. And across Latin America, the tradition of going to the Catholic Church has dropped precipitously, particularly amongst people under 40 years of age. You couple that with the fact that divorce rates in Colombia are the highest in all of the Americas. The number of households that are unmarried is the highest in all of the Americas. So a lot of that is economic. People can't afford to get married. But the fact is that there was two things that held Latin America society together: the church and family. The Catholic Church has lost much of its power and credibility in Latin America, and family structure has changed dramatically. Latin America has gone from an average of 4 kids to 2 kids in half the amount of time that it took the United States to transform. And I'm not here as a sort of right-wing zealot. That's not my politics at all. But you cannot ignore the fact that the region has changed dramatically. And that what has happened at the same time is a rise in crime and a complete dissatisfaction with the political class, which is being amplified by this hyper-transparent world we live in, where there's 200 million smartphones in Latin America who can record any kind of untoward act by a political and put it on social media. And so suddenly, yes, what are people what's their way of reaction is to go back to something when it was safer, when our families were together, when there was less divorce, when politicians were less corrupt, at least perceptively. And the evangelicals have done an amazing job at tapping into that. And that is the basis of their power. And now they're using that power politically. Something like 30% of the Brazilian Congress basically owes its allegiance in large part to the evangelicals. So it's not a short-term thing. It has been building for 25 years. And it's not going to go away again, because unlike Canada, New Zealand, and Germany, which are the most atheist societies in the world but have strong government and they have strong sense of feminism and environmentalism, we need an ism as a moral compass in any society. And Latin America doesn't have those government and other forms of civil society indoctrinated isms. So evangelicalism is filling that void. And I don't see it going away anytime soon. So politics has to adjust to that. And if there is a shining light, it is the sort of rebirth of this idea of zero tolerance on corruption. I'm not saying that's happening right now, but the expectations of voters have changed. They expect that. Whereas I think when I've sat through focus groups of Latin Americans over the last 30 years, the level of political cynicism has been sort of through the roof. And I think that there is a new level of expectation amongst young Latin Americans, partly driven by evangelical thinking, that no, we're not going to put up with that anymore. And that's so difficult for politicians in Latin America to navigate. They're not used to that. They're used to being able to control the message. They can't anymore. And this is part of the political crisis. You have approval ratings in Latin American leaders that, you're lucky if you get to 25%. So it has become, this is not a new thing that's dropped in from the United States or Hungary or Philippines or anywhere else. This has been building in Latin America. It's their own version of populism that's there for a reason.
So I know everybody wants to come in, and Dan, I know Luisa and Eduardo. Back to Luisa. Luisa, so what are the implications for governability in these countries? How might this play out?
So one of the other trends that we have seen in Latin America in the last 20 years is a complete rupture of the party system that existed. And that is a significant change in, it means a lot of challenges for governability. Just Venezuela was governed by a two-party system. Colombia was governed by a two-party system. Mexico, until not many months ago, was governed by, yes, it was a three-party system, but it was a very stable type of political system. And Brazil, for the last elections since the entrance of democracy, it was pretty much a competition between the PT and the PSDB. In Argentina, it was really about the Peronist. So I think having a fragmentation of Latin American political system in the way that we have seen it has also allowed that extreme right religious political parties have a voice. Because when you have when you have a two-party system like in the US, you have a lot of gatekeepers. You have a completely fragmented political system. Everyone has a voice, and just a 10%, 5%, 12% representation in Congress can make you a power broker. So this is a completely different rules of the game in Latin America, and that poses a lot of governability risk. Because, and I'm going to give you interesting statistics, since the 1990s, 30 governments in Latin America have not finished their mandates. That is a reality. More than half of those were because of impeachment or because they were going to be impeached. So the relationship between the executive and Congress in this very fragmented type of political system, which populism, what it does, is polarizes it, makes Latin America political risk a very present and structural part of doing business in Latin America.
Yet, good point, but yet the headlines are very glaring and catch attention, but on the ground level, life is going on. I mean, Peru, for example, is one of the countries. Right? What they've gone, the resignation of Pepe Khan, like, yet it's governability is sort of gotten better. One might argue. In fact, the Vizcarra government is carrying on. They have the anti-corruption legislation. Things have sort of recovered, and so there's.
That's the exception rather than the rule. I see that's the way to see it. This precedent is actually a phenomenon. So I think the way to look at this is that more risky is minority governments. Minority governments have to build coalitions in Congress. That's why Bolsonaro, that's the one risk that I see, is how does a minority government build a long-lasting legislative coalition that can last 4 years. That is not the case of Mexico. Mexico, pretty much, you have a president that has full control of Congress. So that doesn't mean that there's no political risk in Mexico. It just means a different kind of political risk. So it's about, and even in minority governments, one of the things that we have to see is the capacity of governments to be able to do deal making. And so we've talked about that about Colombia. That's one of the things that I think is relevant now about Peru. Why didn't PPK was able to do that, and now the current president is phenomenal that was able to pass even referendum. So it's a new way of doing politics in the region, and the fact that you have minority governments means actually increases the likelihood of populism, because then you have to have delegative democracy. You need high popularity levels in order to get things fast, because then you need pressure from the street into Congress, so you need another actor. So it changes the way you do politics.
Great. Well, I think when we talk about Brazil, we'll see exactly how that's going to play out. And Eduardo, maybe hold a comment on how this is going to play out in Mexico when we come to the part about Mexico, because, as I say, even though the headlines, the fact of the matter is the day in, day out governability and the strength of the institutions may uphold, and may not necessarily going to be overthrown, and life will go on in some sort of institutional manner. But to what extent they will, and what the subtleties are, and that we'll examine in a country. But you want to jump in now? Go ahead.
Just a quick question. Yeah. I think the democracy is a lot more about than just going out and vote. Democracy is about citizens becoming involved, and people become involved with their democracy because you care about the environment, and so you fight for bike paths, and you join an association that does it, and you care about your school funding, and you join the PTA, and you fight about that. That in Latin America is very young, and it's only starting. And there's two very important risks happening in the region right now. I think the first one is the re-emergence of these caudillos who are strongmen and don't care so much about civil society in countries where civil society is only being born. The second one is the constant, and this is more in Mexico, but I think there's risk it starts happening in other places, the referendums being used for everything. That has two problems. The first one, it discredits expertise. Do I have the capacity to choose whether an airport is viable or not? I don't. The same way I don't ask a referendum of the next 10 people that walk by the corridor when I go to the doctor whether I should have a heart transplant or just have eat healthier. I shouldn't be asked to vote about an airport, but this constant referendum discredit expertise, and that's happening. The second thing that I worry about is if you start having constant referendums, you may create voter fatigue. If you create voter fatigue, you start having a less active civil society, and that can undermine democratic institutions in a region where democracy is very young. That was all I wanted to say.
Great, thank you. Dan, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to reflect for a second on how unusual last year was in terms of election year in Latin America. The region as a whole has around 650 million people. Three countries, Mexico, Brazil, and Colombia, represent around 375 million people. And the way that the election cycles work, as many of us in this room knows, Mexico runs on a 6-year cycle, no re-election. Colombia and Brazil on 4-year cycles, possible re-election. And so 2018 was the first time since 2006 when all 3 countries had elections the same year. But the last time there were re-elects in Colombia and Brazil. So it's actually the first time since 1994 where there was an open seat in all 3 countries. And as Luisa and as some of the other panelists said, we're in a time now where the traditional political party system is totally fractured. So in 1994, there were strong, vibrant political parties in all these countries. And last year, there really wasn't. And so while you have this kind of massive change taking place in the region, and the victory, essentially, of electoral populism, I think the narrative this year is what is the interaction between populist leaders and institutions? And we're going to have an opportunity to see that from the right, in the case of Brazil, from the left in the case of Mexico, and I think that is going to be a kind of main challenge driving forward. Now, broadening out even a little more, in 2019, although we kind of look at it as the elections this year as the leftovers, these are actually a series of very important elections as well. You have 3 countries in Central America, with El Salvador, Guatemala, and Panama. You have, as you alluded to, Ken, Argentina at the end of this year, as well as the election in Bolivia and in Uruguay. And so this is an extremely important set of elections to follow on that, and I think you're going to see some of these trends repeat in terms of populist leaders in some countries, certainly technocrats. Luisa mentioned as well that the number of presidents that don't finish their mandates, which is definitely a phenomenon. However, a related phenomenon is it's very rare for a president in Latin America to lose re-election. Re-election. I mean, I was kind of going through my mind. The only one I could even think of offhand was Hipólito Mejía in the Dominican Republic when he changed the constitution to run again and then lost. But after that, you'd have to go back quite a ways. And so incumbency is still very much favored in all of these. And I think I know we'll get to Argentina, but when you look at Macri down the road, although he has a lot of headwinds against him, the bottom line is if he's an incumbent president in Latin America running for re-election, yes, that's a pretty nice spot to be in.
We'll break from tradition. I think we're covering the macro issues now. We start off, and we're going to now go to country specific. Maybe it's a good time to take some questions from the audience on the kinds of themes that we've been talking, a little bit more on the macro level. We do have, and we have a microphone or several microphones. If you just put your hand up, fantastic. We have 1, 2. Yeah, please. We have him in there.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk so far. I was just wondering, tied into the populism discussion, the role you see income inequality playing in that. Maybe more generally, do you think current levels of income inequality are sustainable? And how do you think that's going to interact with populism in the future? Thank you.
Okay, we'll harvest a few of them, and then we'll. So the first one was about income. Those income inequality. Is that correct? Okay. Yeah, please.
Hi. You brought up China, and there's been some problems with the China's Belt and Road Initiative. We'll get into that later. In Ecuador, I think there's a dam that has some problems. I just wonder how active that Belt and Road Initiative is in Latin America, since it doesn't involve just China's neighbors, it's the whole globe.
Great. Yeah, please.
Yes, thank you. My question is in regards to migration and immigration policy. And my question to that is, we look at the existing context in the United States, which we look at the government shutdown is almost directly as a reason to migration and immigration policy. But also in Canada, we know that over the next 10 years, Canada has set targets to bring in 3 million new immigrants. My question for the panel is in regards to when we look at economic activity, free trade agreements that are done in the Americas, typically migration and immigration policy is a significant component of those agreements, but it's not given as much attention in comparison to the economic commerce that's taking place in those agreements. In 2019, do you see anything with any of the Latin American countries in flexibility with Canada in trade agreements where we're going to see some flexibility in their migration and immigration policies?
Okay. Do you want to? Well, we're actually you want to address that now?
No, it's okay.
Come back to you?
Or you want to come back to me on that question?
Yeah. You want to talk? A little bit later. Okay. That's all right. Policy still in formulation? Yeah, no. I was just giving you an opportunity. Okay, 3 great questions. The long-term viability of maintaining income inequality or not properly addressing income. John, you want to go? Go for it.
Yeah, I'd like to address that because that's a great observation as well as a question. We once did a study for PepsiCo. I'm not sure exactly why they're interested, but it's sort of long-term thinking. And we did a study that looked at how Gini coefficient, which is the number that actually measures the consolidation of wealth in a country, how a change in the Gini coefficient impacts the politics. And what's interesting is that from a Canadian perspective or from a Western European perspective, when you look at the degree of inequality in Latin America, you say, gosh, why aren't they revolting tomorrow, you know? But people get accustomed to their situation. But over time, how that changes matters. So we don't measure ourselves sort of in the global basis. We measure ourselves against our peers. How am I doing versus my peers? And when the Gini coefficient moves in a country, that is, if it gets better, then generally voters will either choose a pro-business or the status quo, if you like, establishment type politics. And if the Gini coefficient's getting worse, then they'll move towards a populist. So if you look at the Gini coefficient in Venezuela ahead of Chavez, it's clearly it was collapsing as the price of oil collapsed, the middle class spending power collapsed, they moved towards. You saw the same in Nicaragua. At the same time, you know, Brazil with all the resource monies coming in, and with the Zero Fame program, the Gini coefficient improved, and so they didn't. But in Brazil, the last 3 years, they've gone through the worst recession in a century, and not only that, but the level of household debt went from like 17% to 42% of income from 2006 to the start of the recession. And so people were, not only were their incomes dropping and unemployment was rising, but the cost of servicing their debt went up. So Brazilian households really got hit the last 3 years. That's part of the angst that led to Bolsonaro. There's other factors, crime, et cetera. So it's a hugely correlated thing. People vote with their pocketbooks. They don't think about geopolitical issues. They vote with their pocketbooks. That's the #1 driver. It's even more important than safety and security, even in Latin America, if you look at polls and what are their driving issues. So it is a hugely important issue. And in Mexico, the income disparity has been steady but not improving for several years. And so that has been part of what drove also the fact that the PRI lost all credibility under Peña Nieto. They chose a terrible candidate to lead in this election, and the Panistas had a pretty inferior candidate as well. But there's other conspiring issues. But underlying that angst of the middle class is the fact that their situation has not dramatically improved in Mexico. So it's the #1 driver of, I think, underlying driver of populism.
It's an interesting issue, but we'll leave for the side for today. But whether, in fact, in Latin America, it's across the board, people vote with their pocketbooks. It would be an interesting conversation to have, with certain exceptions. But yeah, thank you, Luisa.
So, income inequality, and the one that we have in Latin America, is one of the explanations why leftists or the left has been so strong in Latin America, because you demand redistributive policies. Now, the World Bank did a fantastic study in where they actually went through the change in demographics in Latin America and how in the last decade there was a significant expansion of the middle class. There is a reason why populism in Latin America historically has been from the left, and populism in developed markets is from the right. There is a reason, and the reason has to do with the structure of the demographics of the region. So as the region has expanded its middle class, the middle class demands better public services. They care about corruption. They care about institutions. They care about security. So to me, the emergence of Bolsonaro has a lot to do with the significant expansion that occurred under Lula's watch of the middle class and the demands they're making now for crime and for the rule of law. So I'm not sure if this is a trend that will continue, but I do think that as demographics in Latin America change, also the dominance of the left might be really weakening, and we might be seeing the emergence of a more strengthened right that in the past had been authoritarian and military towards a more electability of a more extreme right type of movements.
Jonathan?
Yeah, so this has a lot to do with Brazil, but I think there is relevance to the rest of the region as well. I very much agree with what Luisa just said. So that we can look at the glass half empty, we can also look at it half full. This is in Brazil, this Bolsonaro phenomenon is a rejection of a really perverse political economy in Brazil. So, I mean, yes, income inequality, of course, is legendary in Brazil. It's traditionally the highest in Latin America, one of the highest in the world, only challenged now by China. But what really I think this reaction is about is the way in which government largesse is distributed in Brazil. So 80% of that largesse goes to middle sectors, as it used to be the political scientist term for the makeup of the demographics in Brazil. These are not poor people. These are people with jobs. These are people who have, generally speaking, government jobs, great pensions, pensions where if they retire at 52 with 20 years of service, they get 70% of their pay forever, and their spouse. So it's not just the fact that these economies are producing unequal results, is that on top of that, there is this political economics apparatus which is entirely inappropriate for a country at that level of socioeconomic development. And I think Bolsonaro, and it's not like he's hidden it by any means, it's been extremely explicit, saying, I'm attacking this system. This system is unfair, it takes away from the poor, and it gives to the middle sector, middle class. So I think that this more legitimate political movement, which has its growing pains, clearly, and is associated with a lot of very unnice things, I think is fair to say. But nonetheless, this construction is new. I think it is new. There is something, I think, that we have to, it's a phenomenon that is not just part of some cyclical political process in Latin America.
But even Chile, I mean, the results of CAS, extreme right political party, this is, I think this is something to watch.
Yeah, I agree. And by the way, you can look at Europe for your examples, which goes back to my point about Berlusconi. Which Italy's system and Brazil's system, if you look at it, sort of pound for pound, how these systems work, they're practically identical.
Dan and Edward. Go ahead, Eduardo, and then Dan will bring you in.
And a characteristic about Latin American populism, which I think is a little bit different from the rest of the world, which is it tends to be much less responsible economically, which I think comes back to financial markets. An interest rate is the cost of money. In a region where there's no penetration of mortgages and things like that, the average person in a country doesn't understand that the cost of money matters, and it doesn't hurt them when the cost of money changes. If I have a mortgage and my government is fiscally responsible and the yield curve starts blowing up, I suddenly feel in my pocket, as John was saying. In Latin America, because you have such shallow penetration of financial markets, people don't care. You take as many liters of milk as you can get before the system blows up. And that means Latin American populism can be much more dangerous economically.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I'll take the question on the Belt and Road Initiative, which is an interesting one. And for those of you who aren't tracking this is the proposal put forward by President Xi in China several years ago to create infrastructure investment around Asia, and that's now been expanded to Europe, potentially Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. And I was actually in China over the summer. I was invited by Shanghai University for a lecture series on Latin America. So I went over, but also had an opportunity to engage with several Chinese think tanks and scholars and so forth. And one thing that struck me very powerfully is that while everyone's talking about the Belt and Road Initiative in China, it's a major priority, the whole concept has this level of kind of ideological and geographical flexibility, which is very interesting because it really has evolved, I think, quite significantly over the last 5 years, including the inclusion of Latin America. At this point, Chile has joined, Argentina has joined, a couple other countries in South America. But most of the kind of projects that have gone forward under this are the types of things I think would be happening anyway. So it's almost a retroactive labeling of Chinese investment in Latin America as part of the Belt and Road Initiative versus something that's being created specifically because of this proposal. And I'll also just touch briefly on migration. I know there's a bit of a Canada angle to the question, maybe a US angle too. But one of the big phenomenons that I think is going to continue to shape politics and economics in Latin America as a whole over the coming years, interregional migration. What does this consist of? Well, this obviously consists of the millions of refugees that are fleeing Venezuela into Colombia, Brazil, other countries. There's been a huge influx of people from Central America northward through Mexico, trying to make it to the United States, but some also remaining in Mexico. And then you have kind of other interesting forms of migration. You had a number of Haitians several years ago that moved to Brazil, and then when the Brazilian economy collapsed, they started to go outbound into places like Chile and others. You even had Haitians at one point crossing the US-Mexican border who traveled up overland through Brazil. And I think that you're seeing a number of governments in the region that are under increasing duress due to inbound migration from other countries in distress. And I think that, while it may not be a major element in the populism of Latin America today, I think I could see that being an important feature going forward.
I would just say I think it does have a significant relevance today in Chile. Mm-hmm. Significant relevance in Chile. You know, there have been, you're probably aware of this, incidents in a number of the mining settlements between migrants and locals that have gotten quite out of control. And so this has become more politicized than I think anyone would have expected in Chilean politics.
Right, and Chile in some ways is one of the more isolated regions in Latin America. It's everywhere, an ocean on one side and the Andean mountain range on the other. I mean, it's not...
Even during colonial times, it was
right,
sort of
exactly.
Sort of,
I mean,
and do your thing and, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting stat. In the United States, 16% of Americans are born outside of the United States. In Argentina, the number's higher. In the DR, the number's higher. So there is significant migration within Latin America that's gone on for a long time. That's not really written about because it's generally filling an economic need. In Argentina, they needed cheap labor on the farms. In the DR, you know, Haitians they do all of the menial work in the DR. And today, actually, you know, the first 2 million Venezuelans who left Venezuela were highly employable, educated, middle-class Venezuelans. And if you talk to an employer in Argentina who's fed up with hiring Argentines, they're quite happy to hire Venezuelans. So those Venezuelans have been kind of a supply-side boost to a lot of the economies that they've gone into. But now, the prospect of another 5 million Venezuelans leaving the country as things go really off the rails will then dip into a sort of social economic level of Venezuelan who are not necessarily an asset to the countries they go to. They are not necessarily skilled. And then we'll see, I think, a lot more pressure, political pressure in Colombia and other places, and an anti-immigration stance forming.
Yeah, it's been remarkable how well Colombia has conducted itself given the pressure that it's been under. I mean, you can go to any city in Colombia now and there's very visible signs of what this has done. And to the government's credit, the previous government and the current government particularly have said, no, we're not going into xenophobia. That's not what this is about. And particularly, always note that Venezuela for many years took in millions of Colombians who were fleeing Colombia because of the issues there. So Colombia's been battling a very courageous and ethical fight, I think, in trying to help, particularly with respect to that. I think with those questions, you'd want to say anything about immigration? Yeah. Maybe we'll go to the country by country analysis, and I just want to give Brazil a rest for a second.
Poor Brazil.
Again, all these issues are seminars for one country is a seminar for an entire day, and we've covered Brazil. We will come back and cover Brazil again, because I think there's plenty of things to be said about that. But let's move elsewhere in Mercosur. Let's talk a little bit about Argentina. Right? And Argentina has had a little bit of a rough year economically. It's fallen GDP of 2%, inflation of 47%. They need to go to the IMF for bailout loans. At the same time, they've been the leader in pushing for a free trade agreement with Canada, the Mercosur countries, which the Argentine negotiators tell me they think will actually happen this year, which I know for a lot of Canadian companies don't think so much about doing work in Mercosur, but one of the great advantages of it would be that Canadian companies would be able to compete on level playing field for government contracts in Mercosur countries, which would be a great benefit. It would be the first free trade agreement that Mercosur has signed really with a developed country. So that's something that, at least from coming up from the south, I think will be consummated this year. Yet alone, President Macri, who's up for election this year, has been doing okay politically. I mean, the country still seems to be with him by and large. What do you see coming for Argentina in the year ahead? Who would like to? You want to take a shot at?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think of all in 25 years of following politics in Latin America, one becomes pretty cynical in terms of one's expectations. But when Macri was elected and what he did in the first 100 days in terms of how hard that government worked, the quality of people they were at least trying to recruit into their government, ultimately a lot of the first choices said no thanks. But the point is that there was widespread optimism about things in Argentina. The fact that he chose a kind of middle path in his reforms, he didn't go too neoliberal because he understood that he didn't want to disenfranchise the poorest in his country. So whether it was cutting back on subsidies, but he let 25-30% of the poorest households remain at their highly subsidized electricity and water and other utilities. This all looked very clever and very sensible. His ability to capture offshore Argentine monies and balance the budget in short order looked great. The fact is that the exogenous situation changed. The rising Fed meant that currency traders actively sought out countries that looked vulnerable. And 15 years of Kirchnerism has an impact. And what he inherited and the accounts that he inherited meant that Argentina was vulnerable, and that proved to be the case. I think that bringing in the IMF in Argentina is kind of like trying to pass gun legislation in the United States. It's sort of the third rail of politics. And so Macri himself, although there is a general, I think, more than 50% of Argentines still understand that the policies that Macri was pursuing are sensible and necessary. He has suffered himself, his own political brand has suffered tremendously. So what does that mean next year? I think that if he's still a great political operative, I think a better one than people gave him credit for when he was elected. He was able to pass an austerity bill, which meant convincing a lot of people to sign up for it. But if his own political brand becomes an obstacle to re-election by the Cambiemos, then there are others who will step in to the fore, including the governor of Buenos Aires. She could lead the party. And as somebody said last night, Cristina is the gift that keeps on giving, was the quote I think you said. I can't remember who it was, Ken or...
Yeah, it's one of my favorite.
She remains the most popular leader of the Peronists, and the one who, if she doesn't go to jail, would be the likely leader. So at this point, I think Macri's kind of hoping that the courts go light on her or just delay the process enough that she actually becomes the leader of the Peronists ahead of the election. Because although she counts on a support of about 25 to 30% of hardcore supporters, there's enough, I think, of a majority who would sort of pinch their nose and say, okay, we're on the right path. Yes, 2018 really hurt, and 2019 is also going to hurt, by the way. But we're on the right path, and we don't want to go back to Cristina's policies. So if she becomes the leader of the party, and whether it's Macri or somebody else that leads Cambiemos, I think they will survive the political process. Now, if the external environment suddenly becomes more difficult, if the economics, if the peso, which sort of stabilized for a while, continued, or if the purchasing power of Argentine suffers more because of devaluation, then the degree of desperation, or if the opposition is able to bring people to the street in such a way that it just shuts down large tracts of the economy, which they're capable of doing, then that may be different. But at this point, my prediction would be that Cambiemos wins. We have another 4 years, and that finally money falls into Vaca Muerta and to the other significant export-oriented, natural resource-oriented investment opportunities in Argentina. That money that is still held back, that wants to go there but is looking for a clearer political picture.
Yeah, and hopefully there's not another severe drought, which actually took a big hit on their economy as well.
If I could just jump in for a second. I mean, I essentially agree with the analysis. I think that, although Macri in some ways was very unlucky, he was unlucky at the right time. Which is to say, if you were to have this big economic crisis, it's nice to have it after you do well in the midterms, and when you have a year and a half to go before the next election. And so I think the question is he going to essentially run out of runway? In other words, is his popularity rating going to be able to come back up in time, and he can present a credible plan? And the second thing I would say, it's nice to kind of speculate that it's helpful to Macri to have Cristina be the candidate, but she won twice before, and she's still there. And we saw a similar dynamic, I think, play out with Lula a little bit in Brazil. We don't really know what would have happened if he'd been able to run. Probably Bolsonaro could have triumphed, but certainly Lula would have done much better than Haddad. So I'm not sure her staying out of trouble is a big boon to Macri.
Yeah, Luisa.
Let's be very clear. This is a binary outcome. Either if Macri does not win, Argentina is going to be in deep trouble.
Even if Massa were to win for the.
Well, the likelihood that Massa. If the Peronists divide their vote, because it's not only Cristina, it's that the Peronists also divide their votes, so that Iturbide, for example, or Massa, or whoever. It's not clear how markets are going to take Massa, but Argentina is a highly indebted country with significant dollar financing requirements. You need a Macri. Massa, the markets will not sure how much they will give him the benefit of the doubt. He will have to. It will be kind of a Lula 2002. You have to name maybe not Cavallo, but you have to name a very, very credible finance minister from the start. So I think we have to put that election in that context.
And his intra-party political maneuvering will be a lot more complicated.
The other thing is that we don't know what the lineup looks like. And what we have learned in Latin America is that anyone can come from anywhere. And so there are some rumors that a TV presenter, another one, might jump into the election, and he might present himself not dividing the Peronismo, but dividing Macri's space. So our base case scenario, with the information that we have, is that Macri reelects himself. But we do think that this is an election that is going to lead to significant volatility, because all elections last year, the Turkish election, the Mexican election, the Brazil election, pre-election, there was significant volatility because markets do not like uncertainty. And so once we get a clear picture of what the lineup looks like, I think we're going to be more comfortable about Macri's chances, even though our base case scenario, meaning 50% probability that Macri wins. The other thing is, with respect to the changes in Argentina, the good part of this is that Macri is really overseeing a significant structural change from a point of view of the fiscal accounts and the current account. We do think that the Vaca Muerta issue is for real. At this level of oil prices, maybe not so, because you're really, really cutting into break-evens. But the numbers on oil production and natural gas production coming already from shale are amazing. YPF is already, Argentina will cease to be an LNG importer in the next 2 years. YPF is already contracted a pilot LNG liquefaction tanker. It's going to be a very a small one, but the prospect of Argentina becoming an LNG exporter in the next 5 years, if the current trends on shale continue, the government is extremely optimistic, but they also depend on Macri's re-election. So Argentina's fate, to me, is very tied to what happens in politics.
Yeah, I would like to add to that very briefly, if I might. The comment that many years of Kirchnerism doesn't go away quickly is an extremely important one. Even Macri was overseeing an economic policy-making process which had lost touch with just how skeptical foreign markets are about Argentina, even in the context of having very strong cabinet, very strong mission and vision. The tinkering that was happening in the central bank at a time when the rest of the world was just looking at a much bigger scenario around Fed normalization, and they were like rearranging the little chairs on the Titanic. It was actually, for anyone looking at it from far away as an investor, is like kind of a joke. And as a result, they got smacked. It didn't matter who was sitting in the presidency. So I think you can't have 30 years of a soft currency and routine economic crises and defaults without having to earn it back over a long period of time. So that, like Luisa was saying, the expectation and the hurdle is very high. Second point is, to our previous conversation, I think if Macri was vulnerable in any particular area, I would say it's not only on the left, it's on the right. There's a political space on the right, which he has very subtly tacked towards it with the Jair Bolsonaro phenomenon emanating from Brazil. I think we will either see him sort of play a Jacques Chirac type role, meaning kind of scoop up a little bit on the right, or you can see a construction politically on the right, which starts to mouth the same kind of populism that you're seeing in Brazil.
Well, there's a lot to continue up, but let's keep traveling west over the mountains. Eduardo, you want to talk a little bit about Chile?
Yes. I'll cheat and lump Chile and Peru in kind of the same argument because I think it's important to explain why in both countries, contrary to much of the rest of the region, we can't ignore politics. In Peru, the number of presidents have been kicked out, thrown in jail, etc. the past 18 months is ridiculous. Yet, it doesn't matter. Chile and Peru have something the rest of the region should try to replicate. Some are trying and doing partial results. But what these two countries have in common is that both have fantastic fiscal positions, no debt, and massive and very quickly growing pension funds. That means there's such a surplus of capital in both countries that interest rates are developed country levels, which means people have mortgages. The level of investment in both economies is ridiculous. Peru is the only country in Latin America that can approach Asia level of investment to GDP, close to 30%. Chile is next in line. And that comes back to the decision they took 30 and 40 years ago of creating very large contributions into domestic pension funds, which in turn led to very high investment rates, which in turn led to very low levels of hurdle rates for investment, which in turn means for both countries, a bad year in growth is a good year for the rest of the region. And that creates very positive political dynamics and very positive dynamics for the country as a whole. So I think I'll close with that, but I think Chile and Peru are normally the darlings in Latin America for markets, and I think it comes back to that. This was a decision taken 30 and 40 years ago to create very large endowments of contributions to your own accounts for domestic savings. And at the same time, they did very prudent fiscal management, so the government did not eat away those public savings, which created very favorable dynamics for both countries, which in turn means in both countries we can almost look through the politics. I think they're the only two countries in the region where they don't really matter.
John, did you want to say something about?
Well, just another plus for both countries is there is a consensus amongst voters that, and in Peru it gets a little complicated in the Sierra in terms of local community opposition in some areas to mines, but generally both countries have strong mining laws that have survived political attack. I remember when Ollanta was running, he wanted to change things, and the mining community came ahead and sort of said, okay, we're willing to change, and they proposed ahead of and sort of helped Ollanta save face in terms of achieving a change to the royalty makeup without it really damaging the industry. But the mining industry has brought billions of dollars of investment, and probably more importantly, stability to the currencies, particularly in Peru, but also in Chile, and has helped, although there's been squandering of the royalties, particularly in Peru, but it has really helped develop communities outside of the capital cities and economies outside of the capital cities. So, and it's given purchasing power to the middle class that is consistently being there. So their dedication to strong mining laws that can withstand political attack has been crucial, and really they're alone in Latin America in that particular field.
Okay, let's keep going up north along the Andes, Colombia. Dan, you want to start us off?
Sure. So I had the opportunity to be in Colombia over the summer for a conference and met with the kind of outgoing leadership and with President Duque and his team. And, you know, frankly, I was very impressed. I mean, that he had a very clear vision for the country. He has a whole concept around the orange economy and innovation, which is very important. And in contrast to some of the other elections we discussed with both Mexico and Brazil, where you had kind of people who were simultaneously long-time political figures and outsiders, Duque is a relatively fresh face in Colombia. Obviously, he had the patronage of former President Uribe, which helped push him over the finish line. And so I feel kind of as with Macri in the early period, I mean, it's a individual that has a plan, has a relatively good team to execute. But Colombia continues to face very deep structural challenges. There's the issue of implementation of the peace accords, compliance with OECD, which it joined recently, but there's still some skirmishes about where they are in terms of some of the labor and trade issues. And then, of course, this issue of cocaine production, which simply shot up quite dramatically at the end of the Santos administration and which continued through the first year. And in the United States, President Trump has threatened at various intervals to quote unquote decertify Colombia as a partner on the drug trade. And I think that Duque has some time on this, but this issue is going to come back around in September of this year. I do also want to just give credit where credit is due. There were some allusions earlier to the U.S. withdrawal, perhaps, from the hemisphere, but Secretary of State Mike Pompeo did travel to Brazil for the inauguration of Bolsonaro and met with President Vizcarra of Peru, and then went on to Colombia to meet with President Duque over the New Year's weekend. And I think that the U.S. and Colombia are trying to figure out a way to, you know, keep what has historically been a very good relationship on track, and which has been much more bumpy than is traditionally the case in the first 2 years of the Trump administration.
Fair enough. At the same time, though, that meeting between Duque and Pompeo in Cartagena raised a lot of concern in Colombia around the narrow issues that the U.S. cares about in Colombia. This administration seems to care about. And so there was a lot of concern expressed in Colombia about, okay, we're back to the drugs agenda and the security agenda, and Venezuela, which of course is important, but not about any of the other issues that Colombia might want to engage in. And so there is that counter push now in Colombia saying, well, it's great that the U.S. and wants to be friends with Colombia, but on what terms, on what issues, and how punitive could the U.S. be if Colombia doesn't toe the line, particularly on the drugs thing, which is a very complicated issue tied up in the peace treaty. Mm-hmm. And so there is that fear in Colombia, I think, a fair fear that this is going to get distorted again, and it's going to really affect the relationship going forward, and the kind of help that Colombia might want to normally expect from the United States. You don't
right.
see
Well,
that?
I mean, I think that some concern on behalf of Colombia is justified, but I would look at it a little bit differently. I think for the United States, right now, the questions of counter-narcotics and Venezuela are threshold issues for a relationship with Colombia. And if President Duque comes forward with a plan and a willingness to engage forthrightly on those issues, then that after that, it really broadens the aperture where Colombia can engage much more broadly with the United States on issues of additional concern.
Yeah. Yeah, Luisa, please. I just, go ahead, Luisa.
No, I don't want to interrupt you.
No.
No, okay. Let me be very clear. I'm positive on Colombia. I'm constructive and everything. But let's put some comments here. First of all, Colombia is a country where 40% of its trade, of its exports depend on oil, and it doesn't have a lot of. It's not that this is a country with a current account surplus, it's a country with a current account deficit, which is above 3%. So it has come down from the 7% that it hit in the peak 2016, but there's still some ways to go on Colombia being able to clean up its balance sheet, the external balance sheet, and its fiscal balance sheet. Colombia is one of those places where the fragmentation of the political system, I think, it's a good example of the risk that it brings. We had a center-right government and a center-right Congress, and this government could not pass its first piece of legislation completely. I mean, it was significantly watered down. So, because at the end, it's not if the Congress is center-right, it's that the Centro Democrático had 20% of Congress. So it is the painstaking effort of having to make a ruling coalition that passes your legislative agenda. So I do think that Duque has a fantastic legislative agenda ahead, but looking at what happened with the fiscal reform, it might come much more watered down, and therefore the promise of this very pro-growth type of agenda might not end up panning out in a significant way. The second is that Duque doesn't have a lot of time because re-elections in Colombia are no longer permitted. So he has 4 years. And there's a looming risk of whether Colombia is going to follow Mexico and elect in 4 years its first leftist government, which has not yet done. My impression is that that's a risk. I don't yet give it a significant probability, because what I've learned with immigration is that countries that experience significant immigration and do not vote left, it pushes the electorate towards a more center-right type of electorate. So I think there's a structural issue because of the migration of Venezuela and because you have the example of Venezuela and the left that makes the Petro proposal not as compelling as in the case of López Obrador. But I think Colombia is one of those countries where I'm very positive on the infrastructure side. I'm a little bit more concerned on the oil side because they do need to do something. They either need to get on the shale bandwagon or really discover offshore, but they do have the clock ticking in terms of the most important export that they have.
Yeah, my sense of Colombia, spending a lot of time now in the beautiful city of Medellin, is Colombia will be okay in the way that Colombia is always okay because of the unique and sort of extraordinary quality of the country and the people there. I think the big issue now in Colombia is, for the next 4 years, how okay will it be? And on that, the jury is still out, right? And so there are some issues that everybody knew were going to come into play with the election of Duque. And certain weaknesses that he couldn't get away from, and one of them was his career was created by former President Uribe. Not that he's not competent and a bright guy, but his political patron. I mean, his rabbi was Uribe, and so it was his political base was always going to be contingent upon what President Uribe essentially could deliver. Secondly, because he hadn't even spent a lot of time in the country himself, and that's another issue. Because he wasn't in the country much, there wasn't a lot of loyalty built up around him. Second one was he was always going to have a lot of opposition from his own party, right? So this was a designation by President Uribe that the further right wing of the party, if you can imagine a further right wing than President Uribe, there certainly is in Colombia. They did not trust him from the beginning, and that was always going to be an issue. And so those are just sort of going in problems that he was going to have to figure out and to establish his base. That unfortunately got aggravated by some deeds of his, some not misdeeds in the sense, but some questionable actions that he took, and particularly one which we won't go into details, but it was around naming a special prosecutor to investigate Odebrecht and the conflicts of interest of the fiscal. That was viewed by even Duque supporters, a number that I know was not well handled and actually raised suspicions as to whether or not there was really going to be an honest and an in-depth investigation of Odebrecht, which there has still not happened in Colombia. And the case around Odebrecht is just going to get worse and worse because three key witnesses recently have died. One heart attack, which I think there was cyanide found. One, his son was killed with cyanide, and now somebody else was. And so it's a perfect storm if you want to be an unbelievable conspiracy theorist. And Duque has been wearing that to an extent, and he has not been helped. It hasn't been helped by the fact that he hasn't been able to move forward any of the big structural reforms that he talked about: a political reform, a judicial reform, the taxes, as Luisa referred to. So I don't want to get further into it, but I would say that he's had some recent successes in negotiating a wage hike and settling a student strike that was going on. And so the hope is that he's actually going to find his footing and actually have ministers who are considered to be technically very competent, but politically either naive or feckless or certainly inexperienced, which people think has not been helping him at all. But the jury is out, and just to finish up, and Luisa would say that there is some common knowledge that if Duque's presidency is considered to be not successful, then basically you're setting up a possible scenario of the extreme left, or however you want to clap Petro. I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I think there's a lot to go, and we'll see how it plays out. And it's also a question as whether the center will want to give Duque some political support for what he wants to do. So the jury's still out. And if you follow Colombia, you're always sort of eternally hopeful. Sometimes in the face of facts that wouldn't lead you to be hopeful, but you always are. Anything more about Colombia? No. Okay, I'm still working up the strength to go back to Brazil. Let's do it. Let's go to Brazil. Jonathan, why don't you talk? I mean, there's any number of things that one could talk about. What Bolsonaro has talked about, the opening up the economy, Chicago style has been mentioned. Basically, seems to be a vehement anti-environmentalist. Doesn't have a whole lot of respect for indigenous peoples, sexual diversity, or he would say in one way or another the tyranny of the minorities who are oppressing, good, hardworking, normal Brazilians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we've all heard some of this rhetoric. But there are also institutional constraints on what he can do, and maybe, so one of the questions is, how much of what he says is really going to happen? Will he really want to follow through, and how much was rhetoric? And why don't you start us off on Brazil?
Okay. Well, I think the thing I want to emphasize is that this is pretty historic stuff. I mean, I don't think you can look at this administration and its stated vision and say, yeah, well, that was predicted. No, this is a new construction. This is something that is not. This is something that takes, I think, away from the broad direction of policy. I don't know whether it was PSDB or PT. Quite frankly, I mean, in many ways, Lula was an extension of Cardozo in many respects, both policy as well as even temperament. Frankly, this is something new. So the question is, how new, and how much, like you say, is this just rhetoric, or is it going to actually happen? And I would point to two dynamics that I think we need to understand really well. The first dynamic is something that Luisa raised, which is, what is the capacity politically of this government to get something done? It's a new way of running a government. It's partly as a result of Lava Jato in a way. You can't just sell cabinet seats anymore. Apparently that business is over. But it was very effective, actually, in the period of untransparent government in
Although
Brazil.
he actually, I just read the other day, he actually has more military people in his cabinet than the military governments had when they were running.
That was you stole one of my bon mots. But anyway,
I didn't know you were going to say that.
But anyway, the point is that this is a new non-politicized in big quotation marks cabinet. That is not how Brazil has been run, whether it's been by PSDB or by PT in the past. So the question is, can you actually get something done? I also agree with the concept that to gain the momentum, you have to really dredge society, civil society, the electorate. You have to get your militants out to kind of push these things forward, and that has also not been really the nature of politics in Brazil under Lula or even Dilma, frankly, although there was elements of Stalinist impulse in the latter part of Dilma's government. So that's the first dynamic, and I would say that there is a big constraint on Bolsonaro in that regard. The Congress, this relationship between Congress and the administration is very undefined, and I think will present something of a challenge outside of the executive order-driven stuff that's for the atmospherics, which we've seen, the shutting down of the labor ministry, which, I mean, this is Brazil we're talking about. It really is a striking symbol. It's almost like Lenin coming down, in Minsk or something. So it's a big deal. But I do think it presents a constraint. The second dynamic I think we have to think about is intra-Bolsonaro government dynamic. So there's the military and the neoliberal. And they coexist rather uncomfortably in this thing with a guy who's very much like Trump in the sense that when he's speaking about pensions, the neoliberals going, quite crazy, trying to hide memos from him and stuff like that, like Gary Cohn, whose mother is very disappointed with him. I just came back from Miami. But the point is...
That's who you vacation with?
He's around the pool. His mother's complaining. If Gary were there. Anyway, but the point is that this conflict that goes on within the administration between the military, who is all about get it done, and there was a halcyon day of getting things done in Brazil, and go ahead, versus the neoliberal, which is not interested particularly in any of these interior type issues, but very focused on external liquidity, on the pension reform, and they don't exist well together. So I think my view currently is that the military tendency has a greater level of influence today than does the neoliberal one, despite all the atmospherics around Paulo Guedes and some selections that have been made or at least proposed for the central bank. The final thing I want to say about Brazil, which is really for investors, is this. The quality of people running Brazil is going down. Now, that's an amazing thing to say coming out of a PT government, but it's in the monetary side that I'm most concerned, not the fiscal. The fiscal side probably is better, okay? Just better. Minister of Finance is getting things done. Guedes has a vision. There are all sorts of great things for people like me to be happy about. But it's the central bank that I'm actually concerned about. Campos Neto, decent guy, reasonable market credentials. You have to understand, though, the Central Bank of Brazil is one of the leading central banks, not of Latin America, but of the world. Okay, it has an institutional strength and an academic capacity that was beyond most countries, not just emerging markets, but everywhere. Okay, I like to say, by the way, as a little advertisement for Canada, that partly the reason for that is because of the education that they got inflation targeting in Ottawa. Just look, we're in Canada. We're the Canadian Council for the Americas. I don't mention these things. But anyway, the point is that there is a downgrading of the academic credentials in Brazil, in the central bank. And really what has made Brazil work through this incredibly tumultuous period has been the quality and the steadfastness of that institution. And it does concern me because if the fiscal side is not as effective as Bolsonaro and Guedes have given us to believe, the only anchor here is the central bank.
You've been rocking back and forth, Luis. I don't know if that's like you were praying or you were actually, that was...
No, I agree.
So let me ask you a question, a pointed question. As an analyst, what should people be looking at certainly from an economic standpoint, if you're investing, but political, what should they be looking at over the next year as a key indication of where this government's going to go, and if it's going to be successful, however we want to define success?
So given what we just have outlined about fragmentation of the political system, about minority governments, Bolsonaro has 10% of Congress, pretty much. And so that tells you a lot about the not governability risk necessarily, but his ability. He needs to create a coalition, and he needs, in order to pass a lot of things. And unlike other countries, he actually does need to do things in order to get the house in order. That is, so one of the most important questions for us on Brazil is, how long will the honeymoon last? And how bad is it going to be when it ends? Is this going to be one of those things like Trump and Gary Cohn? How long would Guedes last? Is this really the issues that we're going to face in Brazil? We don't know. I think Jonathan touched on the level of uncertainty because this is totally new. The way we see Brazil is that, to us, Brazil is a parliamentary system dressed in a presidential system. And this is a very very centralist kind of guy, even if he spent 30 years in Congress. So the functioning of that, of the executive versus the legislative body, is of utmost importance. Brazil is a country that impeaches its presidents. Of the 4 presidents that Brazil has had since democracy, 2 have been 50% impeachment rate. So I am not saying, I mean, the level of support and the phenomenon that was his election, and the fact that there's so many military in that cabinet, to us means that probably you're not going there. The risk is really not that high, or actually very low. But what we can see is risk of problems between the executive and the legislative. So that's something for us very important to watch. We don't think in the first quarter you're going to have any issues. The Congress in Brazil starts on February 1st, but they really go on vacation all through the carnival. And so things really start in Brazil at the end of the first quarter. So you're good from a market's perspective for the time being. But because of that dynamics, and because you do need congressional, or you need to build a coalition in Congress, we actually prefer the paramilitary, the parafiscal. So we like Petrobras, Banco do Brasil, those kinds of things in which there is technical capacity. The guys that you have appointed are actually pretty technical ones. And so, and I agree with you that there's going to be some. We're not clear how Guedes as a Minister of Finance that has never ever been in government before, and he's going to Brasilia, to one of the most difficult jobs in Brazil. So we are not sure of that, and so we're not very clear about the sovereign, but we do like everything else, because we do think that that has a completely different political economy dynamics that would actually probably be better.
Can I make one quick point?
Please, and then we're going to move to Mexico.
The appointment of Joaquim Levy at the head of BNDES,
yes.
is the most positive thing I've seen.
Yeah.
Okay, here is a guy who's totally unpolitical. I mean, he worked for Dilma. Okay, he's totally committed to fixing what is a grotesque political economy, as you alluded to. So there is reason to be optimistic. It's just the mechanics that's the issue. Sorry, Eric.
Yeah, just before we leave Brazil, I just wanted to raise one thing. So there were 69,000 murders in Brazil last year. And Bolsonaro ran on a very strong law and order candidacy. And I think that we need to watch really closely what happens in the security side. And if he manages to get security under control, that's going to buy him space in the economic and the anti-corruption sphere.
Agree.
Great point.
I just want to raise one point, which could also bridge nicely to Mexico, if that's where we're headed.
Oh, great!
Next.
You want to do the transition, and then I'm going to be very proud that we actually made it through Brazil. So.
No, and on a positive note, we cannot underestimate the importance of what investor confidence and the momentum that provides, and the contrast that we're seeing in Mexico versus Brazil. So, not only are foreign investors, 3 major banks have signed up to go back into Brazil. But there's another factor. There's almost $5 trillion of Latin American savings kept offshore. And when investor confidence changes, the first money to come back, we saw this in Colombia with Uribe, we saw this in Argentina with Macri, is the savings of the people from that country. So Brazilian savings offshore, somewhere between $1.5 and $2 trillion. If 10% of that was to come back, that's 3 years of foreign direct investment. So that money coming in, coupled with the fact that emerging market money, I think we finally sort of bottomed out in terms of how portfolio managers are putting their money in emerging markets. They're moving out of Mexico and they're moving into Brazil. Those two momentum factors are already providing acquisition power to Brazilian voters. Couple that with maybe security issues and other things. I believe that the political class, although yes, he commands only 10% through his party, there's another 30 to 40% of Congress that is ideologically very much aligned with a reformist policies. Couple that with the fact that if he is able to maintain public support, and right now 75% of Brazilians think that Brazil is on the right track, that's a last week's poll, that I believe that he can actually stitch together congressional support, maybe not for as tough a pension reform as we'd like to see, but for many of the reforms that Brazil has to do. And so that initial momentum, and again, as Luisa points out, we've got to wait until March to actually see if this works legislatively. But I see all of the right moves being made, and that momentum is going to have raises the specter of the opportunity to actually pass these reforms much more likely. Mexico is just the opposite. Lula's initial moves have been so negative, and I know Eduardo is going to expand upon this, that money's leaving Mexico. And so even if he somehow changes course, his ability to regain, now he's got momentum against him, it's not pretty. So.
Yeah, Eduardo, just before you get the one thing that we don't have time to tackle but has to be mentioned is at what cost might this good economic news come? In other words, if he follows through with the social policies that he's been talking about, with the attitude and the violent language that he's been doing, and in addition to the environmental policies, including withdrawing from Paris, how that's going to affect, where that's going to come into play, let alone the tragedy in its own right that those actions would cause, what implications would it have? It's a really important discussion to have. It's probably a little bit premature to have it because we don't know what he's going to do, but it'd just be remiss if we didn't.
No, it already started under Temer. I mean, I spent my summer holidays in Brazil last year and exploring national parks and things. And Brazil is, along with maybe Chile, is the one country that actually looks after its parks and really cares about the environment. And there's a general consensus. And there's really strict rules and they're enforced, which after living in Mexico is just an amazing thing. And you already see under Temer, they were already beginning to weaken those environmental laws. Yeah. And it is going to have an impact. But, it's right now people have lived through this terrible recession and they're desperate and they're willing to put those things aside in the hope for economic security and physical security.
Eduardo, Mexico.
I think AMLO made the right diagnosis of what the country's problems were: income distribution, corruption, insecurity. Sadly, I think in all three counts, his actual diagnosis is his plan to solve the issues is almost polar opposite of what he needs. The first thing is institutions. Solving corruption, solving security depends on creating transparency, independent judicial powers, a strong and clean police. In all those things, he's going backwards. He's recentralizing power, undermining institutions. The formerly clean security forces, the Navy and the federal police, less so, are now being merged, first underfunded and then merged with the dirtier ones. When you put a rotten apple, a clean apple, so like 30 apples, you rot the apple that you had to clean. So on transparency and institutions, I would say he's actually undermining them. On the second front, where he's gotten the whole thing wrong, is income distribution starts with the word income. Without income growth, what you're doing is, yes, you improve distribution, but you're putting everybody down. You need to generate income, and for that you need to create certainty, investment, etc. Decisions like the Mexico City airport cancellation, decisions like the putting a private sector plant in Tijuana that's 60% completed, a $1.5 billion plant to referendum. That's not going to fly for investment in confidence. Creating fiscal uncertainty, raising interest rates, you increase the hurdle rate of all investment. When you hurt investment, you hurt income, and when you hurt income distribution, it could improve, but the wrong way. And the third thing, which I think he's wrongly diagnosing about the country, is that Mexico is unique in Latin America in the sense that the reason investment comes to Mexico is not to exploit natural resources, and it's not because it's a large market. Investment outside of the banking sector, maybe Walmart, all investment in Mexico and the vast majority of jobs, Mexico is a manufacturing economy. It exports 1.7 times more manufactured goods than the rest of the region combined. That means the country is a platform. To be a platform, you need to have attractive cost of capital, attractive access to markets, certainly a lot of things that are necessary for that investment to be there. Otherwise, the Volkswagen plant moves from Puebla back to Germany or Colombia or wherever. He doesn't get that. He doesn't get that you have to create stability. Because the reality of that is if that investment starts going, you're going to have one of two outcomes. Either you will scare investment and thus create unemployment, and if you create unemployment in a country that's already dealing with a massive security issue, and this is coming in a time where we have the 5 strongest years in formal employment creation in the country's history. If in that environment you had a security crisis, what's going to happen when you combine that with an employment crisis? He's going to have a very serious security problem. Alternative two is that that's increasing costs, which is probably one of the reasons why he's so happily engaged with Trump right now. You're increasing Mexican labor costs and Mexican cost of doing business. The problem with that is if that shock gets absorbed rather than through employment and companies moving elsewhere, by the currency collapsing, then you've undermined the income gains that you're trying to create, and so you never increase income distribution in any ways. So I think the problem with AMLO is he made the right diagnosis. The medicines he chose are almost the polar opposite of what he really needs.
Anyone else? I'm going to come to Dan to talk a little bit about where we are with NAFTA, given the new political reality in Washington, or the new NAFTA, given the new political reality. Anyone else want to just chime in on Mexico before we move to that? Okay, Dan.
Sure. Well,
there's some echoes that in Washington with the Democratic Congress, maybe the new NAFTA isn't such a sure thing at this point.
Well, NAFTA's dead. Long live USMCA.
Yeah. Here we'll just call it new NAFTA.
Except NAFTA's not dead.
That's right.
Because USMCA has not passed the Democratic House of Representatives
Right.
and the Republican Senate. I think what we're going to see over the coming year is continued brinksmanship by President Trump. He's going to continue to threaten to withdraw from the existing NAFTA in order to try to move the new trade agreement across the finish line. The Democratic House is really going to be, I think, loath to pass something that could be perceived as a win for President Trump, but that needs to be counterbalanced against the, quote, need to get things done. And the fact is, there's a lot of little benefits that are spread throughout USMCA for a lot of different constituencies. There's something for pharma, there's something for dairy, there's something for labor, although the Democrats would like slightly stronger labor provisions. And so, I would not rule out its passage at all, although I think it would necessitate that the Trump administration managed to thread the needle yet again, as it just barely threaded it the first time to get to the initial agreement to try to get through the Congress. And I should add, we have a leading congressional expert here in Karen Tramontano, so if you don't like my answer, go see her after the session.
We're really short on time. I just, it's a little remiss not to include sort of what are more political discussions now to a degree about Nicaragua and Venezuela, but they will be the subject of at least one big event that we're planning, and so we will handle that separately. But I didn't want to leave today without having some discussion, a bit of the Caribbean / Cuba and its role. Dan, and this is something that you were intimately involved in negotiating the change of the U.S. policy towards Cuba when you're in the Obama administration. Anything that you think that people should be thinking about with respect to the Caribbean now and Cuba?
Well, the Caribbean just on the Caribbean briefly before getting to Cuba, I would really watch political instability in Haiti. I think that government is having severe challenges right now. There was a shock vote in Guyana right before Christmas, where there's no confidence vote, and there may be elections in Guyana forthcoming, important for certain mining interests and energy interests. And in the case of Cuba, yes, so the U.S.-Cuba relationship, it's had its ups and its downs over the years, as no one knows better than the ambassador from Cuba to Canada, who's here with us today. Clearly, I think we're at a low point. There is effort, I think, for some of the basic law enforcement cooperation and other types of cooperation to proceed, but the political vicissitudes make it tough. Our U.S. embassy in Cuba, although the U.S. flag still flies, the building only has a few people in it right now because many diplomats have been withdrawn. And the other thing I would point to is that Cuba is undergoing an important process of constitutional reform, which the National Assembly there just ratified before Christmas, and there will be a nationwide vote in February. And there's been quite a bit of debate throughout this process. And it looks at things such as term limits for presidents, a formal recognition for the private sector. And so while there hasn't been a lot of attention to Cuba's constitutional reform, this is the first big reform effort since 1976. And I think it's an important factor to watch.
Thank you. We're at time. It's 10, but we still can take.
I'm gonna have to go. So.
Okay. Yeah. No.
Sorry.
Please. But are there any questions? Craig. Yeah, Mike is coming. Go ahead, John, if you need to go.
Jonathan's going to miss the fun question.
Sorry.
Quite all right.
Great to see you.
Hi, it's great to see you.
Sorry, I gotta run.
See you, John. So we're pushing on 10 years of doing this. Feels like anyway. Every January. When I first moved to Chile in the mid-90s, if we were doing this panel, there probably would have been some warnings about Argentina and Venezuela. But when I moved down there, those were the two most investable countries in Latin America. And that hasn't worked out so well for very many people who were putting money into those countries in the mid-90s. So I'm curious, I have an inkling and an answer, particularly after Eduardo's talk on Mexico, but Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile were all on the highly investable list 5 years ago. Argentina was still not something anybody would put long-term liquid capital into. Looking forward now, if you're putting 20, 25-year money into Latin America, what's the general long-term view? Because a lot of this is some of the short-term noise that we've come to expect with the region. But in the long term, are there places that are becoming more attractive despite some of the noise we've talked about, and are places becoming, I'm not so sure anymore?
Great. More questions? Ben, or
I'll just tell.
no.
Ben Roosevelt, former Canadian diplomat. I have a question about regional norms. When I began my diplomatic career, it was the Summit of the Americas in Quebec City in 2001, the Democratic Clause added to the OAS. It was a time of real hope for support for human rights and democracy. That obviously took a real beating with the divisions across the region later on that decade. But when I served as ambassador in Venezuela from 2014 to 2017, it was still very much alive. Like it was palpable that there was a degree of regional consensus as the Maduro government crossed one line after the other. But the winds are not favorable at all at the international level. Those norms are taking a real beating at the global level. And now that there's a major challenge to those norms from the right, I wonder what you might think the trend is for the regional consensus. 5 or 10 years from now, are we going to be able to claim that there is a regional consensus at all in support of human rights and democracy?
So it's basically a regional consensus on what we would call liberal democracy, basically. We could take another question. Yeah.
So Latin America is an energy powerhouse, and we're seeing a major transformation in the energy industry around the world with the move to renewables. If there's any words on how they see that playing out in the region.
Sort of the future of energy.
How renewable energy is going to
renewables
impact the traditional sort of energy base of the Latin American economy.
Right. Okay, well, we made it. We're going to make it through the whole morning without a discussion about cannabis. So that's sort of remarkable, actually. But that's another theme. Actually, we'll be doing some programming on that as well. Luisa, your sweet spot, energy.
Okay. So let me start with the traditional energy, and let me tell you where the Latin America is. So since 2014, Latin America has pretty much been at the heart of the supply adjustment in the oil markets. 2015, I think the decline from Latin America was 500,000 barrels per day. 2017, the same. 2018, it was 700,000 barrels per day of decline of oil production from Latin America. Most of that was Venezuela. Now, Canada represents 44% of U.S. oil imports, while 10 years ago, it was like 20%. 10 years ago, Latin America represented 30% of U.S. oil imports. Nowadays, Latin America is 20%. So Canada and Latin America completely shifted its role as oil exporters. Mexico is already, from a trade balance point of view, is already a net energy importer. And so what we have seen is that comparative advantage that Latin America had, it's not that it has completely evaporated, but it has completely been rescaled. So in your initial question is, so where do we go from here? And so what I can see is that the energy sector is very dependent on the rules of the game, not only on oil prices, of course, but on the rules of the game. It is when countries reach, lose their one advantage is that they make significant changes. When oil prices fall, they start to be much more open to foreign investment. When oil prices increase, they start to expropriate. That's the dynamics of Latin America. So what I see in the region is really a shift, first of all, to diversify the energy base. So there is an understanding that oil is not the only thing on the energy industry. There had been a diversification towards gas, natural gas, that we saw in many countries in the region, and now we're seeing really a push on renewables, the most impressive of which has been Mexico. So with that, I think there are some countries that have advanced more than others, but the fact that the energy or the oil and gas conditions of each country is changing is also going to change the dynamics between those countries. So, for example, I'm negative about Bolivia. Argentina, even if I don't believe that natural gas production is going to triple in the next 10 years and oil production is going to double in the next 5 years, even if the Argentine government is way too optimistic, the fact is that Argentina's energy trade deficit is disappearing. And that makes Latin America shift from a natural gas importer probably to self-sufficient or natural gas exporter in the future. So that creates problems for Bolivia. That is an advantage for Argentina. And with the development of the energy sector, and that we saw with Mexico, when you are in an energy reform type of agenda, a lot of things on the energy front also happen. They come with it. So my impression is that renewables in Latin America will be helped in countries where actually there's a very private sector mindset on the whole industry, because it almost flows. And some of these countries, like, it does seem that it has moved in the right direction in Argentina. It has definitely moved in the right direction in Colombia. It is moving in the right direction in Brazil. So I do think that there's a space now on the renewable front, just because there's a cognizance of how, in some countries, of the energy industry as a whole.
John, you've done a lot of work in renewables.
Yeah. No, I want to address the question, Craig's question of where would you bet long term in Latin America, and when you actually have the luxury of looking at a region over 25, 30 years, you sort of have to ignore the politics and look at what are the underlying trends. And there's two really important. There's one very important demographic trend in Latin America that a lot of people don't talk about, because they look at Latin America and go, oh, it's such a young population. It's the fastest aging population in the world, by far. They've gone from an average household of 4 kids to 2 in half the amount of time it took Western Europe and the United States to do that. Couple that with the fact that Latin America is still a net exporter of people. Immigration has not been net immigration into Latin America from other parts of the world has not been a factor since the Second World War. And so the population's growing old very quickly. The number one niche market, and it's no longer going to be a niche market, it's going to be a major market, are people over 65 years of age. And when you get old, there's 2 things you care about: your health and your money, right? So the market for health services, for pharmaceuticals, for the whole Medicare business is booming. It's going to grow at plus 10% for the next 30 years in Latin America. If I was looking for a stable industry to invest in Latin America, it would be that. The other is retail finance. The strengthening of pension systems in Latin America means that the level of homegrown middle-class savings is very different than it was 30 years ago, and people need advice on how to manage that money. So those are 2 very interesting areas. The other part is, and I talked about this at the beginning, is this notion of disruption. The incredibly inefficient service sectors in Latin America are under attack, and anybody who brings a smart business model, app-based model, all of the sort of classic disintermediation models that these, whether it's Airbnb, Netflix, Uber, Coursera, the largest online education system in the world, it's number 1 growing. All 4 of those companies, their number 1 growing market in the world is Latin America. Netflix is disrupting what is a bloated, inefficient, arrogant TV media space in Latin America. Airbnb is disrupting a inefficient hotel space. And the fact that people are looking for income. Latin America has certain structural weaknesses that disruption really helps. Although unemployment rates are officially very low in much of Latin America, the underemployed is a huge number. And the pyramid sales companies like Avon and Amway have made billions of dollars in Latin America over the last 15 years because they were able to exploit the most underutilized demographic in Latin America, and that's women. And disruption allows those people, so it's sort of a supply-side driven opportunity. So disruption, healthcare, financial services are all looking great. Luisa talked last night about the fact that the long-term prospects of oil aren't that great. The other part of it is American competition on gas. The U.S. is building 13 export terminals that will flood northern Latin America with cheap natural gas. It's going to kill the Venezuelans. It's already killing the Trinidadians. It's bad for Colombia. It's even possibly bad for Peru. Whether it will impact Argentina, I doubt it. But the fact is that investment in natural gas will be very difficult, even though the demand is growing. It'll be very difficult to compete with the Americans. So I'm more positive on the 3 I mentioned before.
Dan, briefly, what's the prospect for knitting together again a hemispheric consensus on liberal democracy?
Thanks for giving me an easy question.
To wrap you got 60 seconds to answer that.
Well, I was very sympathetic to the question because we've been a big supporter of the Inter-American Democratic Charter over the years and the regional consensus on democracy. At the same time, that consensus papered over some pretty deep differences in how certain countries viewed democracy, as well as the fact that much of Latin America really had a strong tradition of non-intervention in the affairs of other countries. And I think what we've seen is while there has been, a shakeup of that consensus of democracy, you also see it consolidating more in a group of countries, as was witnessed very recently, the 13 countries of the Lima group basically protesting the inauguration of Nicolas Maduro later this week over the grounds that his election was not democratic. And so what you're likely to see, I think, is perhaps a deeper and more true consensus among a smaller group of countries.
And is it the sense that then obviously one of the disconcerting things was Mexico's withdrawal from that, from the Lima group in supporting that, and that goes back to the historic concept of non-intervention.
Yes, and that's been exactly. That actually does not concern me that much because I saw the the initiative by Peña Nieto to kind of get involved and take a stand on Venezuela as an aberration, and one that was largely driven by the need for Mexico to position itself favorably against the United States during NAFTA negotiations.
Okay, Eduardo, you get the final question.
The investment one?
Great. Yeah, I mean, where's smart money investing now if they're looking for long-term and gains?
I guess the first, I don't think Mexico will become Venezuela. So it's not that I think it's the one to run for the hills on. I actually think there's a few niches which are interesting. For example, going back to the energy point, the erratic policy of the government on energy, I think, will create a lot of niches that will be attractive. If you, like last weekend, you have decisions that create scarcity of gasoline, and you start creating scarcity of power for the private sector, you can put solar panels above industrial spaces and lease it to them, and that way they deal with the volatility of both supply and prices of power. John mentioned, the flight of Mexican money from the country means that assets that would not normally be sold to you may be available. And the floor is set at a relatively high level because first, the strength of the international business community in Mexico, which is massive in almost every sector. But second, because you have a very strong network of international treaties that protect you against, among other things, indirect expropriation, not just direct expropriation. You have explicit protection there from both NAFTA, CPTPP, and the agreement with the European Union, which is different from much of Latin America, particularly Mercosur. In terms of the other countries, I agree with John that disruption is huge. You have emerging things like young professionals who tend to live very close together. So that gives you the capacity to form niches in everything from healthcare. There's companies like Dentalia, for example, that are catering to things like that, to healthy fast food, because you have the demographics which are fast and growing, relatively attractive, and very closely knit, so that opens up niches for you to compete with some of the big players. In terms of financial markets, there's a big rally going on right now in emerging markets, or these hints of that one could come. I personally don't think that will hold, because I think the valuation of U.S. equities, if you compare the dividend yields of Latin American stock markets to the U.S., I wouldn't take the currency risk of Latin America for that difference. That's a bad coffee break. That will lead away your differential. In bond markets, the yields on the stronger countries are relatively low. I would personally wait. I prefer playing the contrarian right now. For example, in Colombia, I think if Colombia acts like it says it will, and they don't hike rates for a while, that means the spread between Fed funds and the Colombian central bank rate in the next 6 months will become like 1.5. At that spread, I don't buy Colombia. That will push the currency to weaken even more than it has. It's the worst performing emerging currency in the world in the past couple of months. That will put inflation pressures. That will create pressure for the central bank. And that will be the moment when the hikes start getting pricing in. And if oil prices rebound, then I think the Colombian peso will be a fantastic thing to buy. Not yet. But it depends a lot on your horizon. If you have a long horizon, I think the flight of local money means it's the right moment to buy long-term assets if you think the country has a floor.
Is that enough investment advice? And if you, as you well know, when you go to Mexico City and go out for dinner with Eduardo, you'll get advice all night.
With the unfiltered version.
With that, I'd like to thank the panelists very, very much. Thank you for coming from far and wide. Thank you, Deloitte, for hosting us. Thank you again to our annual sponsors whose names you see. This is the first event, excuse me, for the CCA this year. We have a full slate of events, many very active this year, not just in Toronto and in Ottawa, but we will also be doing live events in Mexico. We have our continuing bi-monthly live from Colombia webcast, where we have top commentators on what's going on in Colombia, including the editor-in-chief of Portafolio, the main business newspaper in Colombia, as well as the deputy editor of El Tiempo, which is essentially the paper of record in Colombia, and other invited commentators. So please stay tuned. If you would like to join us, please speak to Marta. We'd love to have you join, either as an individual or as a corporate member. Thank you again for coming today. Thank you for your patience. I know we've run over, and we hope to see you again shortly. Thank you.
Thank you.